Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome to a special remastered episode of Explain. Today we are once again discussing guitar pickups. And I wanted to have another crack at this video because since I made the first one about 2 years ago at this point, I've acquired a lot more guitars with different pickups in them. I actually haven't bought that many, but in terms of my pickup selection, I have a lot more that I can do head-to-head comparisons to. And considering the popularity of that video, a lot of people really want to know what the tech is, what the sounds are behind different pickups, whether you're a new guitar player and you're looking for your first real electric guitar upgrade, or you're, a veteran player and maybe just aren't up to date with all the new tech that's out there. Like last time, I'll give a high-level overview of what pickups are, what they do, equally importantly, what they don't do, and go over the different categories and subtypes within those categories, giving some sound demos along the way. That way you can compare and contrast what different pickup techs sound like through the same amplifier, same settings, all that good stuff. Of course, this is not comprehensive. You can take the exact same pickup and put it in a different guitar, and depending on how you might play it, or the scale length, where your fretting hands resting, all that good stuff, you can make the same pickup sound quite different. So ultimately, I would recommend, if you're looking to buy a particular pickup, always listen to a sound demo online and try to find that pickup installed into a similar guitar. That will give you the best idea, because not every humbucker is the same, and that same humbucker in different guitars can sound a little different. So this is just a general kind of rules and guidelines to what to expect for different pickup tech. So what is a pickup? Well, it's these little guys here. I actually have 3 different pickups in this guitar. Pickups work on the electromagnetic principle of induction, which, if you don't remember much of your high school physics, that's when you take, say, something like a coil of wire and you have say electrons spinning in this direction, you put it up next to another coil of wire, you'll get electrons spinning in the opposite direction, that whole equal opposite force stuff. But as we all may know, electric and magnetic energy are simply 2 sides of the same coin. So if you get a vibrating string and you put it next to, say, a center magnet with a lot of copper coil and pole pieces for each string, you induce an electromagnetic response and make a signal. And generally speaking, that's pretty much exactly what a standard guitar pickup is. You have a magnetic core whose material properties can ultimately affect the pickup sound. That's wound in copper wire, which again can be of different coarseness or fineness and amount of wounds, and that will affect the output and frequency response of the end product. You got some pole pieces for each string. Sometimes on like bass guitar pickups, you'll have multiple pole pieces, and that's all pretty much wrapped up in a plastic enclosure. And a lot of the times it's waxed or potted to prevent excessive outside interference, squealing, feedback, and it's all wired to the rest of the guitar circuitry, which includes a potentiometer or pot to control the output level. And then you have another potentiometer or variable resistor that's wired with a capacitor, and that kind of controls the frequency response. And that goes to an output jack. And that's pretty much it. Compared to a lot of audio-centric circuits, the onboard electronics of an electric guitar, at least a standard electric guitar, are fairly simple. That doesn't mean you can't get a lot of sounds out of something that is, fairly rudimentary. So let's say I had this pickup on a slider. If I moved it from the bridge position to the neck position, you'll get some very different sounds. They actually make some older guitars that you can do just that. So the string position very much affects the sound you're getting out of the pickup. I actually have a guitar with 2 identical pickups, one on the neck, one on the bridge, and they sound extremely different. You can also change the rotational position of the pickups. This one is completely perpendicular to the strings, but you'll see on like a Stratocaster type guitar, the bridge pickup is actually off angle, and that gives a slightly different sound per string. You'll see on some shred-centric guitars, the neck pickup may be off center. And then of course on fan fret guitars, where you have multiple scale lengths, where say the bass strings are at a 27-inch scale length, and then you move inwards and you get closer to 25 inches, you'll also have the pickups be kind of off kilter to adjust for that dynamic scale length. So there's a lot you can do with even one pickup. So it's hard to say that, well, this sounds this way all the time. Hence why this video is more of a general guideline. Before I move on, let's discuss one major misunderstanding that a lot of, especially younger guitarists, tend to have about pickups, and that is their microphonic capabilities, or lack thereof in this case, because every time I discuss this topic, I get some very interesting responses. Now, on paper, pickups shouldn't be microphonic at all. They're really caring about the electromagnetic domain. Otherwise, the acoustic properties of the electric guitar would carry much more into the final sound we hear. Now, we don't live on paper, we live in the real world, and stuff like preamp tubes and a high gain amplifier like this can even become microphonic over time, so it does happen. The thing is, if you have an extremely microphonic guitar pickup, you're gonna have a bad time because you're gonna get way more feedback and squealing and all these bad things that you simply don't want. So the common example I always get in comments especially is when people say, well, here's so-and-so band, here's so-and-so song, this guy talked into his pickups. They've gotta be really microphonic then. Not necessarily. In these demonstrations, I want to use a modern high output, low noise pickup through about 15 decibels or so of boost, which is the Fort and Grind pedal. And then I'm going to put that through the already high gain lead channel of the Mesa Mark IV. And then you're going to hear exactly what it sounds like if I talk through these pickups. Now I'm going to do this once with no strings on the guitar and another time with strings on the guitar. As you'll have heard with the no strings example, even with my mouth mere fractions of an inch away from the pickup, you can barely hear a thing I'm saying. And remember, this is through a lot of high gain equipment with a lot of distortion, and this is basically something you would never hear on the clean channel of an amplifier unless you have the output volume cranked so high that you're at ear bleeding levels. So I wouldn't recommend that anyway. But once you throw strings on a guitar and you mute both ends and talk through it, then you get something that kind of sounds more like those recording examples that a lot of people talk about, because the sound pressure coming off your voice is actually making the strings vibrate a little more and amplifying the perceived microphonic qualities of the pickup. So in reality, you're not getting a whole lot of microphonic action, and that's a good thing for everyone involved, as we probably wouldn't be able to stand anything over, say, bedroom levels of guitar playing without enduring even more nasty feedback and squealing. So that's the main thing you're hearing from an electric guitar, is the electromagnetically induced response of the guitar pickup. And yes, you can make it somewhat microphonic in certain instances, but given the capabilities or limitations that I showed you here, I would hardly chalk it up as a functioning microphone in my books. That brings us to the different categories of guitar pickups, and I'll start with the most traditional and probably still the most popular type, passive pickups. And if you're familiar at all with electric guitars, this is probably what pops in your head when you think of a guitar pickup, is a passive type pickup. So what do I mean by passive? Passive means that there's no external power source driving this circuit. Literally, it is those components we talked about earlier with the pickup wired either in series or parallel with other pickups, if you have other ones, going through a different level pot and a tone pot, if you have those at all, some don't, out the output jack. And that's it. All the energy is coming from your picking or strumming of the strings to drive an amplifier. This is the first traditional types of guitar pickups. As such, this is kind of what most people have in their head when they think classic guitar tone. Players from Stevie Ray Vaughan to Misha Mansour have used passive pickups to create their signature guitar tone. So don't have this preconceived notion that just because this is old tech, it all sounds vintage or all sounds old school. That's not the case whatsoever. You can make different passive pickups sound extremely different depending on their construction technique, their materials, all that good stuff. So let's start with the more common type that you'll see on Fender style guitars, at least, the single coil. And they basically look as their name would imply. They're a single coil of copper surrounding a magnetic core. And again, you'll find these are pretty popular on Fender style guitars. Here I have the Telecaster neck pickup and a Stratocaster center pickup. Although plenty of like shred players like Steve Vai, he likes to use a Strat style middle pickup on his Ibanez guitars. A lot of high gain players like the single coil sound on the neck pickup for leads. I do as well. I think it's very suited to high gain stuff, but single coils are more known for their low gain and clean sounds. They kind of have this flat, or at least we perceive them as a more flat frequency response where you still get a decent amount of low end. It's articulate in the middle, but you get a sparkly bright top end that's very touch sensitive, really comes out the harder you pick, and kind of has this glassy, sweet property to it that again is really popular with anywhere from country players to jazz players. But even in the past couple of decades, you have more progressive players that are returning to these single coil type sounds, even if they're not using exactly the same type of pickups, because they have really good properties for all kinds of music. Of course, just like any design, they also have their downside as well. The first of which is they are a bit on the lower output side, which can be compensated if you're playing through a higher gain amp if you want more distorted tones. And most clean amps, especially the kind of the lower wattage, low breakup stuff, that can be a good sound for a lot of people. And most of the time you'll be able to make it up anywhere in the preamp or power amp section. The problem is the louder you go on those amplifiers, the other downside comes out, and that is the hum. Although the high frequency response of a passive single coil is audibly nice, it is always plagued by that little bit of characteristic hum, although it's just not the end of the world in my opinion for the ways that I would like to use a single coil. Plenty of iconic guitar tones and killer songs have been recorded with these exact types of pickups, and you're not going to hear it, especially in a mix. But if you leave two guitars next to each other, one's plugged in to one amp, one's the other, and one has a single coil, the other has a competing style of pickup, you'll be able to hear the one with the single coil is just a little noisier. So that, in my opinion, only starts to really get problematic once you get into more high gain territory, and that's exactly where the next style of pickup comes in, the humbucker. Now, some of you might be looking at that and thinking, what the hell? It looks like they just took one single coil pickup and taped it onto another single coil pickup. And that's because that's basically exactly what they do. You take two individual coils and wire them together and you get the humbucking effect, which for the most part kills all that nasty high-end hum that a lot of people don't like about single coils. And it also gives you an output boost because instead of having one coil per position, you're now kind of summing the output of two. But there is a drawback in the fact that it doesn't sound the same as a single coil. In that humbucking property, you're actually canceling out a lot of the high frequencies. And ultimately, you get a pickup sound that's more dull and rounder and fatter for clean applications, but it's also far more well suited, in my opinion, to high gain applications. And whether it be a model from Marshall or Mesa, Randall, PV, Orange, practically all high gain amp channels are designed with humbucking guitars in mind. So if you're going after more contemporary rock and metal tones, that's probably what you're going to be chasing after. But ultimately, you'll have to decide for yourself. So I'll give you some demos when it comes to single coils versus humbuckers and kind of practical applications. Although these are two separate guitar designs, different scale lengths, different body types, a bolt-on versus a set neck, all that good stuff. This should still give you a fairly decent idea of what most humbuckers sound like versus single coils in a controlled environment. Single coils and humbuckers no doubt make up a healthy majority of the passive family of pickups, but there are a couple more oddball designs I need to touch on before we move on further. First of which is the P90, and I unfortunately don't have an example of that because they're really not up my wheelhouse much, but you can kind of think of them as sitting between a single coil and a humbucker in terms of tone. They are basically a fat single coil. They are still a single wound coil pickup, but they're more in terms of the humbucker size when it comes to dimensions. Not quite, but pretty close. You can also get them in different, like the mini P90 as well as mini humbuckers, but they kind of have a bit more sparkly high end than a humbucker. They have more fat round mids than a single coil, and they're really liked by a lot of classic rock players. They do pretty well in both distorted and clean applications. For example, Tony Iommi used P90 style pickups in his SG-shaped guitars on practically all of the iconic Black Sabbath records. So if you're into that sort of sound, then that's a pretty easy recommendation from me. The other oddball is the coil tap and coil split, and I have an example of a coil split here, and it's kind of another one of those things that does what it sounds like it does. You split the coils in half. In my case, this is on a toggle switch. You can put this on a push-pull pot, like I have on a couple other guitars. You can put this on a 5-way switch. Say if you have 2 humbuckers here that would select, say, you know, the neck humbucker, the neck split humbucker. And what this does is makes a humbucking pickup sound more like a single coil. In my experience, they never sound quite as good as a standalone single coil pickup, but they're definitely very nice to have. For my use case, I need a humbucking bridge, but there are some clean applications where it's like, yeah, it'd be nice to get something that sounds more like a single coil pickup. The difference between a split and tap is fairly minor. When it comes to a split, you're basically disabling one coil altogether, whereas with the tap, you're still leaving it partially engaged. It's still getting some output, but both of them bring them more in line with a single coil sound. For me, I think this is a wonderful tool, especially for live playing guitarists, anyone that gigs, because say if you're playing like a PRS style guitar, something that's already kind of in between the Gibson and Fender sound, then you can just, you know, engage a coil split or coil tap if you need to go to tones that require a single coil sound. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll be dead on the Stratocaster tone if that's what you're shooting for, but it's definitely a lot easier, and most people in the audience are never going to notice the difference anyway. So I find that more useful as a, you know, on the fly type situation. I would still prefer to record with a real single coil over a coil tap, but this thing does everything I needed to do personally. That brings us to the next category of pickups with active pickups. Whereas a passive circuit doesn't require any external power source to generate a signal, with these actually have onboard preamps kind of all wrapped up together in the pickup itself, sort of similar to what you would see on a bass guitar, and that requires a voltage of either 9 volts or 18 volts, or for your real baller, 27 volts to power. This design philosophy has a couple unique advantages over its passive counterparts. First of which is a higher output potential, which is why you saw a lot of high gain players like the Metallica guys or Zakk Wylde switch to EMG active pickups even by the mid 80s. And with that, you can take, say, a decently high gain amp, but something that isn't quite saturated enough or just, full blown overdrive to what you want. You could take, higher output pickups and drive the front end more without needing an external overdrive or distortion pedal and get better results that way. You also have a lower noise floor compared to traditional passives. Like EMG 81, I think, has about a negative 90 decibel volt rating, which is insanely good. No matter what kind of music or style of guitar you play, there's probably some variant of active pickup from a big name player that will work for your style of music. You can get them in, of course, the humbucking shape, in single coils, in 7, 8, 9, I think even 10-string guitar forms now. They've been pretty popular on like stock models like this. Of course, this is an EMG knockoff, but a lot of companies are making their own proprietary designs now. But that's not to say they work for everyone. First of all, you can't find, to my knowledge, a traditional active pickup that has a coil splitting feature. There are new technologies out there that do that, but we're talking about Seymour Duncan blackouts or EMGs. That's a pretty much non-existent feature. The bigger complaint from a lot of people is their inherent sound quality. And it's a kind of a mixed bag, because in some ways I very much prefer the sound of an EMG. In other ways, I would like to throw it in the trash, because you get kind of this natural compressed maximized sound, and it's overblown, I think, from a lot of players that aren't super familiar with them. They think it's just this god-awful no dynamics type experience. It's really not. The problem is you can run into some headroom problems where, say, a strum this hard and a strum that hard maybe don't really sound all that different. A lot of remedies to that phenomenon have come out over the years, whether it be the 18-volt mod to give your circuit higher headroom for more dynamics. You've got stuff like the EMG 707 and 808X series, which kind of already has a lot of those improvements built in, but a lot of people simply don't like the sound of active pickups in certain applications, and I'm one of them. When it comes to standard scale down-tuned 6-string work, I really like the sound of a stock EMG. I even really like it on the neck position for cleans. I mean, the Metallica Roland Jazz Chorus cleans is among my favorite. But once you get into extended range guitar stuff, anywhere from a 7-string to 8-string, I like the sound of a low to mid gain or mid output pickup through a higher gain amplifier to kind of preserve the rawness and the dynamics that I like to hear from those styles of music. So this is something I can only show you an example of, and you'll have to decide for yourself. But they're both good and bad in their own ways. You just kind of have to find what works for you. finally, that brings us to what I would call the oddball of the active world, the Fishman Fluences. And I know they don't like it when people call them active pickups because the technology is very different, but you still need a 9-volt battery at least to run them. But the way these are made are completely different in the fact that traditional active pickups like those from EMG are more or less made kind of the same way that a passive is. You still have a magnetic core, they're still wound, and you're just basically matching that up with a preamp and then wax or potting the whole thing so no one can take it apart. With Fishman Fluence, these are actually constructed out of multiple layers of printed circuit board, and that allows them to do quite a few things. The first of which is impressive manufacturing consistency, which also allows them to more easily design pickups in the R&D stage. Say you bring in an artist like Devin Townsend or like Tosin Abasi, they say, well, I want it to be voiced more like this, instead of having to, you know, play around with different windings and say, okay, try that, see what that does, or try this, I think it'll sound this way. They can go in a CAD program and say, okay, this many windings equals this kind of sound, or this layer does this. We'll just change that out for, you know, something else we already have in a library. So it makes the design and the manufacturing phase much more controllable. What it also allows them to do is create different voicings within one pickup. Whereas with, like, say, a coil split humbucker, you have a humbucker sound, and then you have kind of a, you know, half-baked single coil sound. With this, you can fit in basically 3 different pickups into one. For example, with a lot of their artist signature pickups, they'll have a modern voicing, which will generally be like a EMG sound on steroids, where the frequency response is more focused and kind of shifted towards the bass end. They'll have a vintage voicing, which is a bit more of the traditional passive sound, a lot of dynamics. They'll move the frequency response a little more inwards towards the mids. And then they'll have a completely separate single coil voicing that actually sounds like a single coil pickup. It doesn't sound like the half-baked coil split. It legitimately sounds like a single coil. And the cool part about all of those is they can control the output to the point that the single coil isn't really quieter. That means that if you're flipping between a single coil and humbucking sound while playing live, you don't actually have to compensate for it anywhere else in the signal chain, which is a pretty radical idea. And for me, I just find that Fishman Fluences in general retain more of the passive pickup feel and dynamics. It's just like you have more headroom. It's like they're not really being compressed. It's not really being expanded. It's just louder all the time. It's just more all the time. And that can be a good thing. That can be a bad thing. For me, I love the single coil sounds on this to the point that it's hard for me to go back to passives a lot of the times because of those dynamics, because of the headroom issues. When it comes to distorted tones for process stuff, I think this thing sounds awesome. But for a raw through the amp sound, I still kind of prefer my passives. So it's another one of those things that this does a much better job of being an all-around pickup. In fact, if you have to choose one, that'd probably be the one I'd go with, especially if you jump genres a lot and you need something that kind of does a little bit of everything. I think these guys are nailing it. But for specified different applications, I think that a passive humbucker pickup still definitely has its place. To wrap it all up, this is going to be another one of those videos where I just can't recommend one thing to everyone. Honestly, just go out and try as much as you can. Whether you're in the market for a new guitar or you're just getting started, the best thing you can do is go to as many music stores as humanly possible and try out as many models as you can to get a feel for what you like. And ultimately, even then, whether you're trying it in person or listening to YouTube demos, you're only getting a vertical slice of whatever each pickup has to offer. And that's just the unfortunate part. For me, I wish it was as simple as saying, yeah, these Fishman Fluences are everything I need them to do, or I could just be, you know, like one of the DiMarzio or Seymour Duncan artists and say, yeah, this is my signature set, I can play everything with that. Simply not the case for me. I like EMGs for certain stuff, I like passives for certain stuff, I love these things for a lot of things, but I need kind of one of everything, honestly, to cover everything I like to play and that I like to record. So hopefully your situation will be simpler because you won't have to have a rack full of guitars. But that's about it. So hopefully you found that enjoyable, somewhat entertaining, somewhat educational. If you have further questions, leave them down below. Try to get back to them. And thanks for watching as always. We'll see you next time. Bye.